welcome to Guys, a video series talking about different types of baseball guys. In this episode, we're talking about underrated guys from the 1980s. These are guys who never got the accolades despite putting up great numbers. I love championing an underrated dude. It's like discovering an amazing, obscure band or a movie that flopped but should be considered a classic. So these guys are kind of like the William Friedkin's sorcerers of baseball. This is a movie that came out at the height of Star Wars mania in 1977, and as you can imagine, got completely drowned out despite being, in my opinion, one of the best films of the 1970s and also one of my favorite films of all time. For years, this movie sat collecting dust in video rental stores across America, usually in one of those weird oversized VHS boxes, before people started finding out about it online in recent years. A lot of these players suffered a similar fate, overshadowed by teammates or collecting dust on a bad team. So we're going to do some championing for these sorcerers of baseball.
You do it for me, okay? I'll do it!
Now, with the guys, I generally don't get too into the weeds with stats, but I did use a bit of a statistical methodology to create this roster. It's fairly similar to how I've done the Overlooked Teams series, which you should watch. Hey, why not?
It's free.
What I did for this video was to find the players with the highest WAR total during the 80s who never landed in the top 10 in MVP or Cy Young voting at any point in their career, 80s or otherwise. As much as this is a bit stats-based, I reserve the right to switch it up based on vibes.
The numbers were scary.
Catcher, Brian Downing. I'm going vibes right off the bat here because Downing, who we talked about in our Glasses Guys episode, really only played catcher in 2 seasons during the 80s, and only played in 53 games there before he switched to outfield and eventually became a full-time DH. So that's going to mean we'll need a solid backup catcher when we get to the bench. Downing was a very underrated player who recorded 51.5 career WAR and 27.4 during the 1980s. Downing will also definitely be a starter on the Swole Guys team. First base, Darrell Evans. Darrell Evans is a criminally underrated dude. If you're anything like me, he's mainly known to you as a slugging first baseman / DH for the Tigers. And he was really good for the Tigers from 84 to 88. But this was the tail end of a really good and really long career, but one spent toiling in obscurity on terrible Braves and Giants teams. The early 70s phase of Evans' career was phenomenal, where he was a great fielding third baseman with a power bat and an elite batting eye. In 73, he posted 9 WAR, led the league in walks with 124, and hit 41 dingers while driving in 104 and playing excellent third base defense. He came in 18th in MVP voting despite being 3rd in WAR, so Evans is likely to be the third baseman for the underrated 70s guys team. But he was also underrated in the 80s after he shifted to first. He had 26.1 WAR in the 80s, playing all the way to his age 42 season, when he was admittedly bad. But at age 40, he hit 34 homers and put up 4.9 WAR. He's tied for 17th in career WAR for third baseman with Hall of Famer Dick Allen. Second base, Willie Randolph. You're maybe screaming Lou Whitaker right now, and you are not wrong. Lou is another criminally underrated 80s Tigers guy, but he did come in 8th in MVP voting in 1983. I thought about including him anyway, but I do think Randolph out-underrates Lou. At least Whitaker has a contingent of advocates out there for his Hall of Fame case. Randolph not so much, but I think he has almost as good of a case. I mean, these two are so similar. Obviously, Lou holds the lead in most things here. He's got 3 gold gloves to Willie's 0, but I'd say Randolph was as good, if not better, defensively. Randolph topped out at 15th in MVP voting in 1980. Third base, Toby Harrah. A bit of a similar dynamic as that second base dilemma. There are 2 very similar underrated guys you could pick for third base. And once again, I'm going to stick with the guy who never landed in the top 10 in MVP voting with Toby Harrah. Of course, you may have guessed the other guy is Buddy Bell, Harrah's mirror image. Both of these guys were underrated because they played almost their whole careers on awful Rangers and Indians teams. In fact, Harrah and Bell were traded directly for each other prior to the 1979 season. Harrah had a banner year in 82 with 6.6 WAR, 4th best in the AL, but finished just 20th in the MVP vote. Shortstop, Scott Fletcher. This is a guy I barely even remember from the 80s, but he was number 5 in WAR for shortstops during the decade, playing for mostly terrible teams in the White Sox and the Rangers. He did get some playoff action with the 83 Sox, though. a glove-first guy with some solid on-base skills. Left field, Lloyd Moseby. I've got 3 center fielders roaming this outfield. First up is Lloyd Moseby, who had some tremendous years for the Jays in the 80s, most notably 1984, when he was second in the league in WAR among position players, but came in 22nd in MVP voting. 1984 may be the dumbest year for MVP voting, though, as Cal Ripken led the league with an insane 10 WAR and somehow only got 1 vote. Center field, Chet Lemon. Talked about Lemon in the most interesting teams of the 80s video. Lemon had a surprisingly good career. He put up a whopping 36.6 WAR during the 80s, which was 6th among outfielders for the decade. He was a terrific player for some terrible White Sox teams before being traded to the Tigers, where he continued to be great on a good team, but still managed to be undervalued. He also got snubbed in that same 1984 voting. His best season, with 6.2 WAR, Lemon didn't receive a single MVP vote. And even on his team, he got dissed. He was objectively the 3rd best hitter on the team after Kirk Gibson and Alan Trammell, and yet he mostly batted 6th, 7th, or 8th in the lineup. And to put a cherry on the top of this underrated sundae, Lemon has the most career WAR in baseball history, with 55.7 for a player who never received a single MVP vote in their career. The Rodney Dangerfield of baseball. All right, I'm immediately starting a Chet Lemon Hall of Fame campaign right now just to make up for this injustice. Right field, Dwayne Murphy. This one was a surprise to me. Murphy put up 32.7 WAR during the 80s, and that was pretty much all the WAR he put up. He only played 2 years outside of the decade, but he was really good, a plus defender and center who won 6 consecutive Gold Gloves. Like many guys on this list, he's a bit forgotten outside of Oakland because he played mostly on bad teams, other than when he played great in the weirdo 1981 postseason. DH, Alvin Davis. For DH, I use batting runs instead of WAR since we can disregard defensive value, and the top guy for the 80s without a top 10 MVP year is Alvin Davis, despite the fact that he didn't break into the bigs until 84. This dude could flat out rake. Starting pitchers. A weird thing happened with the rotation here. I'm looking for starters who didn't land in the top 10 in MVP or Cy Young. Well, the results are not all that extreme as compared to the position players. There are no Chet Lemons or Willie Randolphs here. In fact, none of our 5 starters received a single Cy Young vote in their careers, and honestly I can't make that much of a case for any of them, except for our ace, Charlie Huff, who I will say had a couple great years in the 80s and probably should have gotten some Cy Young votes, especially in 1985, when he was a top 5 starter in the league. I'm gonna bunch up the rest of this rotation because they're all kind of similar, solid 3rd starter type of guys. Lloyd Bannister, Danny Darwin, Scott Sanderson, and Jim Clancy. These guys were all good, but not great. Darwin was a swingman type in the 80s who had his best years actually in the 90s. Bannister and Clancy both had their best years in 1982 with 4.7 and 4.9 WAR respectively, but they both got vucked, receiving 0 Cy Young votes while Pete Vukovich took home the award with a paltry 2.8 WAR season. But can't really feel too bad for either of those guys. It should have been Dave Stieb all the way. And actually, here's where I'm going to exercise my veto power and switch it up from the formula. When you're talking about underrated starters from the 80s, you have to include Dave Stieb, the pitching WAR leader of the decade. He was a top 10 and top 5 Cy Young vote getter several times, but he probably should have flat out won 3 consecutive Cy Young awards. He led the league in WAR in 82, 83, and 84. We mentioned how he got vucked in 82, and 83 was just about as bad, with Stieb losing out to the mediocre but 24-game winning Lamar Hoyt. Stieb didn't even get a single vote. Pretty outrageous. Then, 84, as we know, was the most brain-dead year in history for MLB awards voters. Willie Hernandez won the Cy Young and the MVP as a reliever, which, okay, it was a terrific relief season, but come on. Stieb came in 7th, receiving 1 single vote. And you know what? I'm not satisfied with the rest of the rotation the numbers gave me either, so I'm gonna add Rick Rushell. who's a guy that would be a no-doubt pick for an underrated 70s guy team, and maybe even for an all-time underrated guys team. Russell has 69.5 career WAR, which puts him just under the average for Hall of Fame starters, but he's surrounded by a bunch of Hall of Famers on this list. He had a better decade in the 70s, but he was also great and underrated in the 80s. He recorded 26.5 WAR in the decade, despite missing all of 1982 and almost all of 1983 with a rotator cuff injury. In 87, he came in third in Cy Young voting for some reason. I'm not sure why he did so well there, but then received no votes in 85 when he put up 6.2 WAR. He was pitching for an atrocious Pirates team, so that's definitely part of it. I'm going to keep the vibes going here and pick Bob Welch, which really goes against the parameters I put forth at the start of this video, since Welch did actually win a Cy Young Award in 1990, although he shouldn't have. Welch could actually end up on the most overrated 90s guys team. But hard to deny he was undervalued during the 80s. Going back to that 87 Cy Young vote where Russell was third in a mediocre season, Welch would have been a better choice, leading the league in WAR with 7.1, but receiving just a single vote. But how do you compete with the powerhouse that was Steve Bedrosian that year? Welch is also fourth in pitcher WAR during the 1980s, but I bet he wouldn't be one of the first 10 or even 20 guys you'd name if asked who the top 10 pitchers of the decade were. And I'm going to call one last audible here and go with Doyle Alexander to round out the rotation. Alexander is infamous for being the guy the Tigers traded away John Smoltz for in 1987. But Alexander was a very good pitcher, and he was insanely good after that trade in 87. With 4.4 WAR in just 11 starts for Detroit. He had a couple of 6+ WAR seasons in the 80s, including a 6.1 WAR year in 84 when he didn't receive a single Cy Young vote, but somehow strangely received an MVP vote. Again, dumbest year in MLB awards voting. Bullpen. As someone who thinks relief pitchers shouldn't get Cy Young votes very often to begin with, I'm going to zoom right through this pen. My methodology ended up giving me Tom Henke and Dave Smith, but those two guys were pretty celebrated relievers in the 80s, so I skipped them. Starting off, we've got Rick Camp, known more for his clutch power bat than for his solid relief pitching. Then we've got Tom Bergmeyer, a guy who must have figured out something late in his career as he was a mediocre reliever for the entire 1970s and then put up 11.3 WAR in 5 80s seasons with a 2.44 ERA. Then we've got a trio of guys I have to admit I've never heard of. Mustache guy, Andy McGaffigan, Tim Burke, and then another mustache guy, Don Ass. Okay. Bench. Catcher Tony Pena. I said we needed a good backup catcher, and here we go. As one of the better defensive catchers in the early 80s playing for bad Pirates teams, Pena didn't quite get the respect he deserved. His 5.9 WAR 84 season was second for catchers only to Gary Carter in the 80s. Well, to 5 different Gary Carter seasons in the 80s, but still, Pena didn't get a single MVP vote in 1984. Shortstop. Gary Templeton. Templeton is most known for being the guy the Padres traded Ozzie Smith for. Now, certainly an all-time terrible trade, but Templeton was a solid player. His best years were with St. Louis before the trade, but he did have a couple of solid seasons in San Diego before falling off. Mookie Wilson, the famous solitary milk drinker of the 86 Mets.
I can't think of any other milk drinkers. I think it was not even plural, milk drinker.
Wilson had perhaps the coolest ever slump-breaking routine. Dude knew how to bust out. Mookie did get a single solitary MVP vote in 1989 in one of his worst seasons. Then we're going to round out this roster with a quartet of second basemen. Frank White.
Frank White is a free man.
No, not that Frank White, the baseball Frank White. Bill Doran, who was an incredibly consistent second baseman during the 1980s, who did get some MVP votes, but maxed out at 11th place. Johnny Ray, who I believe holds the record for most WAR during the 80s for a guy I have never heard of. I do not remember this guy, which is weird because in addition to being a consistent, solid-hitting second baseman, he also has a great name. Sounds like the name of a troubled teen in a 1950s melodrama.
Johnny, he was trying to explain you didn't give him a chance.
And finally, we've got snake guy Glenn Hubbard, who is a consistently good, but not great, glove-first second bagger. All right, thanks for watching. Let us know who we got wrong on this list, although we did do this with numbers, so you can't get that mad at me. But let us know who your favorite obscure, underrated players are from the 80s. And hell, if you've got any obscure cinematic gems we should all watch, throw those in the comments too. I'm always on the lookout for the next sorcerer.
You got